The forgotten American mission that broke Germany's last defense, 7 March 1945. The town of Remagen sits quiet under a gray Rhineland sky, smoke drifting from the ruins of buildings already hit by artillery. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann of the American 9th Armored Division crouches behind a stone wall, staring down a steep slope towards a structure that should not still be standing. Below him, spanning the widest natural barrier in western Germany, is the Ludendorff Bridge. Gray stone towers rise from each bank like the gates of a fortress, and stretched between them, iron girders carry 2 rail lines across 400 meters of fast, cold water. German engineers have wired the bridge with explosives. American commanders, studying their maps that morning, have already written this crossing off as impossible. Every other bridge across the Rhine for hundreds of kilometers has been destroyed, blown by retreating German forces determined that no Allied soldier will cross this river without paying in blood. Timmermann does not know it yet, but in the next 20 minutes he is about to lead a mission that no one planned, that almost did not happen, and that would tear a hole through what remained of Germany's last great line of defense. This is not a story about a weapon forged in a secret laboratory or a device unveiled with fanfare. It is the story of an accident of timing, a demolition charge that failed to fully detonate, and a small group of soldiers who chose to run forward across a bridge rigged to kill them rather than wait for orders. What happened at Remagen would shorten the war in the West, save thousands of lives on both sides of a planned river assault, and expose just how close Germany's collapse truly was. For nearly 6 years, the Rhine had loomed in German strategic thinking as the last unbreachable wall. Napoleon had struggled against it. The Kaiser's generals had relied upon it. Now, in the final winter of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler and his high command staked what remained of their hopes on the same conviction, that so long as the river held, Germany held. By early 1945, the military situation for Germany had become catastrophic. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last major gamble in the West, had consumed the reserves that might otherwise have defended the Rhineland. Soviet forces were advancing from the east at a pace that made the outcome of the war no longer in serious doubt among German staff officers, whatever the public rhetoric still claimed. In the West, American, British, and Canadian armies had fought through the Hürtgen forest and closed up to the river's eastern bank along a broad front. The Rhine represented not merely a geographic obstacle, but a psychological one. Cross it, and the war moves onto German soil in the West with nothing left to stop it. Fail to cross it quickly, and the conflict could drag into another costly summer campaign, with Allied planners already contemplating a river assault on the scale of the Normandy landings, complete with amphibious craft, artillery bombardments, and airborne drops. Every bridge mattered. German engineers had spent months preparing demolition charges on all the Rhine crossings, wiring spans with hundreds of kilograms of explosives, ready to be detonated the instant Allied forces drew near. By the first week of March 1945, this policy had worked with brutal efficiency. Bridge after bridge fell into the river as American forces approached, sometimes only hours or even minutes ahead of capture. Commanders on the ground had grown to expect it as inevitable. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, opened in 1918 and named for the German general Erich Ludendorff, was a double-track railway bridge originally built to move troops and supplies during the First World War. By 1945, it had been adapted for both rail and limited road traffic, and it remained, remarkably, one of the last bridges still standing across the entire length of the river. The Germans defending it knew its value. Responsibility for its destruction fell to a patchwork of officers, engineers, and Volkssturm reservists, some of them barely trained, operating under confused and contradictory orders from a chain of command that was, by this stage, breaking down under the sheer speed of the American advance. This confusion, this fog of a collapsing defense, would prove to be the crack through which the entire mission succeeded. The soldiers who found themselves converging on Remagen that morning were not part of some elite, specially trained demolitions unit assembled for a single daring raid. They were regular formations of the United States 9th Armored Division, part of General Courtney Hodges' First Army, advancing largely by chance towards a town that intelligence reports suggested might still have its bridge intact. When forward reconnaissance elements crested the high ground above the Rhine and saw the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, the news traveled up the chain of command with real disbelief. Brigadier General William Hoge, commanding Combat Command B of the 9th Armored, made the decision that would define the operation: seize the bridge immediately, before the Germans could finish the job of destroying it. The technical challenge facing the Americans was not a matter of clever engineering, but of raw courage under a very specific kind of threat. German engineers had already partially wired the bridge, and eyewitness accounts describe explosive charges lashed to girders and support towers, with detonation wires running back to a plunger position on the eastern bank. As Timmermann's men began their advance down the slope towards the bridge deck, the Germans attempted to blow it. A charge did detonate, throwing timber and debris into the air and briefly convincing American troops that the crossing had failed. Yet when the smoke and dust settled, the bridge was still standing. The primary charge, for reasons debated by historians ever since, had failed to fully ignite, quite possibly due to a severed detonator wire caused by earlier artillery fire, or perhaps because the explosive itself, a lower-grade industrial demolition compound, rather than a purpose-built military charge, had been insufficient for a structure of that size and mass. Whatever the precise cause, the bridge sagged, buckled slightly, and held. What followed was a sprint across nearly 400 meters of exposed rail bridge under direct fire, soldiers running past unexploded charges still wired into the structure, while combat engineers attached to the unit worked frantically to cut demolition wires and physically throw remaining explosive packages into the river below. Sergeant Alexander Drabik is generally credited as the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank, sprinting the final stretch as German defenders, disorganized and undermanned, offered resistance that was fierce in places but never coordinated enough to stop the advance. Within roughly 10 minutes, American infantry held both ends of the bridge, and combat engineers set to work clearing the remaining explosives, working in a structure whose stability nobody could fully guarantee, aware that a second wave of German demolition attempts, using artillery fire directed at the bridge itself, remained a very real danger. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Word of the capture reached General Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters within hours, and the reaction was one of genuine astonishment mixed with rapid recalculation. Eisenhower is reported to have said the bridge was worth its weight in gold and immediately ordered reinforcements funneled across it as fast as possible, understanding that every hour the crossing remained open represented an opportunity that might never come again. Over the following days, an entire bridgehead was established on the eastern bank, with American divisions crossing in numbers that grew from hundreds to tens of thousands, supported by pontoon bridges rapidly constructed alongside the original structure once its stability came into serious question. German forces launched repeated attempts to destroy the bridge in the days that followed, including artillery bombardment, attacks by German jet aircraft, and even an attempt using frogmen to plant demolition charges beneath the waterline, though this last effort was reportedly detected and prevented before it could be carried out. The comparison with what German forces achieved elsewhere along the Rhine, and what Allied forces had planned in case Remagen had not fallen, illustrates just how significant the capture proved to be. Every other Rhine crossing in the American, British, and Canadian sectors had already been destroyed by the time Remagen fell, a demolition record that had until that week been essentially perfect. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding Allied forces further north, had been preparing Operation Plunder, a full-scale assault crossing of the Rhine scheduled for later in March, involving amphibious vehicles, extensive artillery preparation, and airborne landings by British and American paratroopers, on a scale deliberately built to rival the Normandy landings themselves. The unplanned success at Remagen did not cancel that operation, but it fundamentally altered the strategic picture, giving Eisenhower a foothold on German soil weeks ahead of schedule and forcing German commanders to divert reserves southward to contain the growing American bridgehead, reserves that would otherwise have strengthened the defenses Montgomery's forces faced further north. Adolf Hitler's fury at the failure to destroy the bridge was severe enough that 4 German officers connected to its defense were court-martialed and executed on his orders, a measure of just how catastrophic the German High Command understood the loss to be. The bridge itself did not survive long, weakened by the initial demolition attempt, by continuous German artillery fire, and by the sheer weight of traffic crossing it day and night. The Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed into the Rhine on March 17, 1945, 10 days after its capture, killing more than 30 American engineers who were working on it at the time, and injuring dozens more. By then, however, its strategic purpose had already been served. Pontoon bridges and additional crossings had been established alongside it, and the bridgehead on the eastern bank had grown too large and too well supplied to be threatened by the loss of the original structure. The material impact of the Remagen bridgehead is, among historians, generally regarded as significant, but not, on its own, war-ending. Germany's collapse in the spring of 1945 was already underway on multiple fronts, and it is likely that Allied forces would have crossed the Rhine successfully within weeks, regardless of what happened at Remagen. What the capture achieved was speed, and speed in the final months of a war carries its own kind of weight, measured in lives not spent on a delayed, heavily defended amphibious assault, and in weeks shaved from a conflict that was, by March 1945, still killing thousands of soldiers and civilians every single day it continued. The psychological effect on German command was severe and well documented, precisely because the Rhine had been presented to the German public and to German soldiers alike as the line that would hold. Its collapse, sudden and almost accidental in character, undercut morale at a moment when the regime had little left to offer beyond the promise of an unbreakable defense. Today, the towers that once anchored the Ludendorff Bridge on the western bank at Remagen still stand, preserved not as a monument to victory, but as a peace museum, the Friedensmuseum Brücke von Remagen, opened to reflect on the bridge's history and on the cost of the war that ended around it. The eastern towers, damaged in the fighting, were later demolished, but photographs and fragments of the bridge itself remain on display alongside accounts from soldiers on both sides who were there in March 1945. 7. March 1945 began as a day when American commanders expected nothing at Remagen but another blown bridge and another delay. It ended with a foothold on the eastern bank of the Rhine that no one on the Allied side had planned for, and that no one on the German side had been able to prevent. Karl Timmermann, Alexander Drabeck, and the soldiers who ran across that damaged, smoking mined structure did not know they were making history. They knew only that the bridge was still standing, that the way across was open, and that every second spent hesitating was a second the Germans might use to finish what their explosives had started. What they achieved in those 10 frantic minutes rippled outward for weeks, reshaping the final campaign of the war in the West, forcing a change in German strategy, and denying Hitler the one thing his final defense had depended upon most: time. The Rhine, Germany's last great barrier, the line that was supposed to hold, did not hold. It broke at Remagen, and it broke because a small group of tired, frightened soldiers decided that a bridge rigged to kill them was still worth crossing. Nothing about the mission had been planned in advance. Nothing about it had been guaranteed to succeed. And yet, for 10 minutes on a cold March morning, it changed the shape of the war that followed.